When Jada and Janelle Rivers enrolled at an esteemed, predominantly white private secondary institution, they anticipated challenges. However, the reality that awaited them far surpassed their wildest apprehensions. From the instant they passed through the immaculately maintained entrance, Ryan Mallory and his cohort of tormentors made it their express purpose to dismantle them. The twin sisters endured every taunt, every physical jostle, and every disparaging remark directed their way, but when the harassment escalated to physical aggression, leaving the twins with no alternative but to respond, what the aggressors failed to grasp was that Jada and Janelle were accomplished martial artists, tutored by a father who instilled in them an unwavering refusal to yield to animosity. The tormentors erroneously presumed they were preying on defenseless individuals. They could not have been more mistaken. Before we proceed, kindly share your geographical location in the comments section and ensure you subscribe, as tomorrow's narrative is one you absolutely do not want to miss. The sun, in its zenith, cast a warm yet unforgiving radiance across the expansive grounds of Rosewood Hills Academy. It illuminated the manicured lawns and the imposing brick edifices which stood like silent sentinels guarding the students assembling in discreet clusters. The entire ambience of the establishment exuded an aura of affluence and venerable traditions. From the meticulously trimmed shrubbery to the gleaming stone pathways, the academy appeared to have been conceived not merely for academic pursuits, but as a constant reminder to all who traversed its grounds of their precise standing within the societal hierarchy. Jada and Janelle Rivers, moving in unison, perceived this unspoken message as a palpable weight upon their shoulders even before they reached the main entrance. Their uniforms were immaculate, their bearing upright, and their countenances composed. Yet, beneath this veneer of composure, they keenly felt the intensity of every scrutinizing gaze that followed them, every hushed utterance that escaped the lips of students they passed. They were accustomed to scrutiny, to whispers. However, this felt altogether more piercing, more frigid. This was not mere curiosity. They could readily discern the distinction. This was the type of attention steeped in preconceived judgments, in a definitive delineation established before they had even uttered a single word. Their conspicuousness was not solely attributable to their status as newcomers or as identical twins. It was fundamentally because they were black. And within this environment, that characteristic rendered them exceptionally visible. Their father, Derek Rivers, had forewarned them of such potential circumstances. He had not shielded them from the harsh realities of the world. He had prepared them to confront such moments. He had instructed them to carry themselves with inherent strength and dignity, irrespective of the adversities they encountered. Crucially, he ensured they possessed the means to protect themselves should the occasion arise, not merely through verbal defense, but through a level of skill and self-command seldom seen in individuals their age. Nevertheless, even with the benefit of his extensive tutelage and years of diligent preparation, entering this domain felt akin to stepping directly into an observable tempest, one that had been discernible from miles away but utterly unavoidable. "Observe that," a male voice declared, its volume amplified to ensure it was heard without a hint of discretion. The speaker, positioned against a column near the school's main facade, sported a smug grin, his companions snickering beside him. "Twins?" another youth interjected with a derisive tone, as if the very concept was an affront. "Didn't realize they came in matching sets." Jada's gaze momentarily shifted toward them, noting their puffed-up chests, an ostentatious display of territorial entitlement. A surge of indignation pulsed within her, but she swiftly suppressed it. Her father's voice, calm and resolute, echoed in her mind. "They desire a reaction. Do not grant it to them." Janelle's grip tightened on her backpack strap, her knuckles whitening against the dark fabric. Yet, like her sister, she maintained an impassive and inscrutable expression. The unspoken connection between them was profound, and she was acutely aware that Jada shared the same smoldering intensity she felt, lying dormant beneath the surface, awaiting its moment. They had no need for verbal communication. Their shared experiences had forged an intrinsic understanding, enabling them to act and think as a singular entity. They proceeded forward without faltering in their stride, their focus fixed on the entrance ahead, consciously disregarding the oppressive scrutiny they felt pressing against their backs, akin to sunlight magnified through glass. The deeper they penetrated the courtyard, the more pronounced the underlying message became: this institution was not designed for them. The polished floors, the towering windows, the gleaming display cases, and the proud banners adorning the walls all seemed to constitute a theatrical backdrop for a play in which they were never intended to participate. Yet they continued onward. "Disregard them," Janelle murmured, her voice low but steady, a self-admonition rather than advice. She spoke without glancing at her sister, confident in Jada's intuitive comprehension. "I perceive them," Jada responded, her tone subdued, yet carrying an underlying sharpness. "But I will not afford them the satisfaction." They reached the formidable double doors of the main building, which swung inward with a hushed mechanical glide that seemed incongruously smooth given what lay beyond. As they crossed the threshold, the cool air conditioning greeted their skin, yet it was insufficient to quell the burgeoning warmth within them. The students already congregated in the hallway turned in unison, conversation ceasing as eyes tracked the twins' progress down the corridor. Some gazes conveyed curiosity, others open hostility, and a select few registered a flicker of something more sinister: amusement, as if anticipating the moment the new arrivals would falter and provide them with cause for derision. Jada's gaze swept across the hallway, dissecting it as if it were a map of territory delineated by invisible boundaries. She observed the clusters of bullies congregated near the lockers, the girls whispering behind their manicured hands, casting furtive glances laden with veiled malevolence. Every detail registered. Every look felt like an unspoken challenge awaiting a retort. They understood this was merely the commencement. The stares, the whispers, the barbs uttered just audibly enough to inflict pain, yet discreetly enough to be deniable if confronted, all of it represented the nascent stages of a crescendo that would inevitably demand acknowledgement. Yet they were prepared. They had weathered more formidable storms. They had undergone training for precisely such tempests. Although the sky above Rosewood Hills Academy appeared serene and cloudless, Jada and Janelle could sense a palpable tension building in the atmosphere, the promise of an impending storm lurking just beyond the horizon. They would not be the instigators. Their father had instilled in them a higher standard. However, should the storm approach them, they would not retreat. And when it inevitably arrived, it would encounter a force far more formidable than it anticipated. The initial days at Rosewood Hills unfolded precisely as Jada and Janelle had foreseen, yet this predictability did not lessen the burden of their experience. From the moment they entered their inaugural class, it became glaringly apparent that every pair of eyes was fixated upon them, not with welcome or curiosity, but with a frigid, silent judgment. The classroom itself was impeccably arranged and brightly lit, with sunlight streaming across the pristine desks and reflecting off the polished floors. However, no amount of illumination could obscure the palpable disdain with which both students and instructors treated them, as if their presence was unwelcome. Teachers would call their names without direct eye contact, their voices devoid of inflection, their attention already disengaged, as though the twins were mere entries on an attendance roster. In the corridors, the throng of students seemed to subtly alter its flow, deliberately obstructing their path, compelling them to step aside or decelerate their pace, all while feigning innocence. This was no accident. They recognized it, and the surrounding students were equally aware. Nevertheless, Jada and Janelle withheld the reaction the provocateurs craved. They maintained their composure, proceeded with deliberate purpose, and refused to be cornered by the palpable tension. Even as the stares intensified and the whispers grew more pointed, they persevered through each day with quiet determination. It did not take long for Ryan Mallory to make his presence known. He was easily identifiable, carrying himself with an air of absolute entitlement, his gait marked by a nonchalant swagger that bespoke an awareness of his immunity to the institution's rules. His perfectly coiffed blonde hair suggested a meticulously curated image. He wore his uniform as if it were a costume, his tie loosened and his shirt untucked, a blatant display of his disregard for convention. "Hey," Ryan announced one morning as the twins traversed the courtyard toward their lockers. His voice, loud and self-assured, was clearly intended to command attention. His associates gathered around him, already chuckling as though they anticipated the punchline without requiring its delivery. "Did you two get lost on your way to the staff entrance?" he inquired, his words cutting sharply through the open air. His companions erupted in uproarious laughter, the volume disproportionate to the feebleness of the insult. However, their amusement stemmed not from the wit of the remark, but from the target of its derision. Janelle maintained her forward gaze, her expression serene, her pace unwavering. She denied them the satisfaction of a backward glance. Jada's eyes briefly met Ryan's, her gaze sharp and steady, yet she too continued her progression. She observed the smirk on his face, witnessed his companions nudging each other, feeding off the generated attention. Despite the tightening in her chest, she suppressed her burgeoning anger. They both did, but Ryan had not concluded his performance. "Perhaps they don't comprehend English." He amplified his voice further, ensuring maximum audibility amongst those in proximity. "Maybe we should attempt communicating in their native tongue." "What is it? Primal grunts?" The ensuing laughter was more pronounced this time, spreading through the crowd and drawing in additional students who had previously been indifferent. Now they watched, expectant, some amused, others curious, none moved to intervene. Jada's jaw clenched, her teeth grinding together, but she took a measured breath, regaining her equilibrium. She felt Janelle's close proximity, her presence a stabilizing anchor against the tempest Ryan sought to unleash. They continued their movement. In the ensuing days, the situation steadily deteriorated. Ryan's confederates, Zach and Brent, intensified their harassment. They adopted a strategy of deliberately bumping into the twins in the hallways, scattering their books onto the floor with feigned apologies and smug expressions that betrayed their calculated intent. "Didn't realize they were allowing janitorial staff to attend classes now," Zach muttered one afternoon as he brushed past, ensuring his words were audible to nearby students. "Perhaps they're just here for practical experience," Brent added with a smirk. "The school has to maintain cleanliness somehow." The twins offered no verbal response. They retrieved their scattered belongings, straightened their postures, and moved on. However, with each deliberate shove, each veiled insult, the pressure incrementally increased, akin to a mounting weight, testing their capacity for endurance before succumbing to its crushing force. Compounding the difficulty was the pervasive silence from their peers. No faculty members intervened, and no students voiced any objection. Even those who did not participate in the harassment averted their gaze, simulating ignorance. The instructors remained absorbed in their paperwork or their digital screens, exhibiting a marked reluctance to become involved or to acknowledge the presence of any ignoble elements lurking beneath the academy's pristine facade. At their residence, their father detected the subtle indicators, despite their efforts to conceal them. Derek Rivers had not only equipped them with self-defense techniques and honed their physical prowess, but had also cultivated their ability to anticipate adversity and recognize the subtle omens that foretold significant challenges. Over dinner, he observed his daughters with keen attention, noting the tension in their jaws and the weariness in their eyes. He refrained from direct questioning, allowing them the space to articulate their experiences when they felt ready. Upon finally confiding in him, he listened without interruption. "You recall my teachings," Derek stated that evening, his voice calm but firm. "Self-control is power. They aim to provoke you. Do not permit it." Jada nodded, her lips set in a resolute line. Janelle mirrored her sister's resolve, though a discernible flicker of frustration, increasingly difficult to conceal, was evident in her eyes. "They are escalating," Jada conveyed, her tone measured. "The pressure is steady but intensifying." "Each day brings a greater challenge," Derek affirmed without hesitation. "They believe you will falter. They desire it. And if they do not cease, Janelle inquired, her voice equally composed, her intention unambiguous. Derek's gaze met theirs. In that shared look, there was an absence of hesitation, an unwavering certainty. Then they will discover that you are not the ones who break. His words lingered in the air, a silent covenant that the twins carried with them into the subsequent days. Allowing this unspoken promise to reside just beneath the surface of their composed demeanors, they navigated the corridors of Rosewood Hills with their heads held high, fully cognizant that the impending escalation was not a matter of if, but when. And that moment was rapidly approaching. The days blurred into one another, each more chilling and unforgiving than the last, as if the very walls of Rosewood Hills had gradually constricted around Jada and Janelle, exerting just enough pressure to continually remind them of their unwelcome status, with each passing hour serving as a further test of their resilience. They had maintained their composure through the taunts and the whispers, through the petty insults and the forced laughter of students who had long since learned that cruelty was rewarded, not penalized, within these halls. Yet beneath their placid exteriors, they felt the steady, inexorable buildup of pressure, like storm clouds gathering prior to a torrential downpour. It was Ryan, predictably, who determined that verbal assaults and minor physical altercations were no longer sufficient. He had always sought a larger audience, a greater capacity to push boundaries until a breaking point was reached. Sensing the nascent fissures in their composure, he lost no time in orchestrating a scheme of sufficient cruelty to capture the attention of the entire student body. A maneuver designed to humiliate the twins in a manner they could not possibly dismiss, regardless of their outward show of fortitude. The plan itself was uncomplicated, as true malice rarely necessitates complexity, particularly when bolstered by arrogance and a complicit entourage. The ordeal commenced one morning with the discovery that their lockers had been defaced with abhorrent, hateful epithets scrawled across the metal in thick, dripping red paint. The slurs were brazen and unrestrained, displayed for all to behold. Black markers had been employed to create grotesque, caricatured visages, their exaggerated features intended to mock and dehumanize. Crumpled papers, crammed with progressively more vile insults, were thrust through the locker vents as if the perpetrators had engaged in a contest to devise the most offensive message. As they stood there, shoulders squared, faces taut with the effort of maintaining control, the surrounding hallway erupted in sharp, cruel laughter. Students paused to point, to capture images on their mobile devices, disseminating the spectacle like an epidemic. Some guffawed openly and unrestrainedly, while others stifled their amusement behind their hands, feigning discretion. However, their reactions were inconsequential. The twins witnessed and felt every barb as a piercing sting. Ryan, leaning casually against a nearby locker, arms crossed, observed the unfolding scene with a wide, triumphant grin, his eyes alight with victory. Zach and Brent flanked him, both exhibiting smug satisfaction, their self-congratulatory demeanor evident in their posture. "Figured we'd offer some decorative enhancements," Ryan announced loudly, his voice laced with mock solicitude, ensuring his words reached every corner of the hallway. "Thought it might help you feel more at home." The assembled crowd roared with laughter, the sound surging through the hallway like an overwhelming tidal wave, relentless and deafening. For a fleeting moment, even the teachers who happened to pass by paused, their gazes lingering briefly before they swiftly averted their attention, feigning unawareness and shirking their responsibility. Janelle's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her fingernails digging into her palms as she fought to maintain a steady breath, her chest constricting with a fury she struggled to contain. She could sense her sister's presence beside her, feel Jada's incandescent rage simmering just beneath the surface, held in check solely by an immense force of will. They had endured the verbal abuse, they had endured the physical jostling, but this was fundamentally different. This was a public, calculated performance designed to strip them of their dignity before the entire student body. And despite their valiant efforts to remain grounded, the weight of the humiliation pressed down with an intensity exceeding anything they had previously encountered. Their father's words resonated in their minds, calm and unwavering, urging them to maintain their composure and let their discipline guide them. However, as the laughter continued unabated and Ryan stepped forward with a slow, mocking clap, both sisters felt that precarious boundary thinning, that fragile line separating patience from action. "You should express gratitude," Ryan sneered, now standing in close proximity, his voice low but sharp enough to pierce the cacophony. "It requires considerable effort to make individuals like you feel as though you belong." The crowd hung on his every word, their eyes darting between him and the twins, expectantly awaiting a reaction, the slightest crack in their formidable defenses. Jada's gaze locked onto Ryan's, her stare unwavering and intense. Though she remained silent, the message conveyed by her eyes was unequivocally clear. Janelle, standing equally steadfast, felt the same fiery indignation surge within her chest, her pulse quickening as she drew a slow, steadying breath against the rising tide of her fury. They would not provide him with the reaction he so desperately sought. Not yet. However, neither could they delude themselves into believing this incident would simply dissipate. They both understood that a critical juncture had been reached, a point of no return. This was no longer merely another insult to be disregarded. This was not something they could casually dismiss like the hallway whispers or the classroom snickers. This represented a line irrevocably crossed, a direct challenge hurled at their feet before the entirety of the school. Later, as they meticulously cleaned their lockers, wiping away the paint with coarse paper towels provided by the janitor, who studiously avoided their eyes and offered no commentary, Jada's voice finally broke the heavy silence between them, low and resolute, imbued with a burden that had been accumulating for far too long. "No more," she declared, her tone subdued, yet as unyielding as stone. Janelle did not require clarification. She felt the same burning resolve within her, the same fundamental erosion of the patience they had so diligently cultivated. She nodded once, sharply and decisively. "No more," she concurred. The decision was not born solely of anger. It stemmed from a deeper wellspring, from the profound understanding that mere survival was insufficient. There were moments when passive acquiescence meant sacrificing integral parts of oneself, irretrievably lost. The decisive moment was imminent. They sensed it with the same clarity as the air they breathed. The next time Ryan and his entourage initiated their aggression, they would not retreat. They would engage, and they would fight with the same ferocity and skill they had been meticulously trained in from their earliest years. The atmosphere at Rosewood Hills had not softened in the aftermath of the abhorrent prank. If anything, it had become more oppressive, akin to an unseen atmospheric burden that permeated everyone's awareness. The courtyard buzzed with a palpable tension as students congregated in their customary locations, their conversations hushed, their glances subtly directed towards the paths they knew the twins would inevitably traverse. Jada and Janelle, as ever, moved side by side, acutely aware of every scrutinizing eye, every hushed remark swirling in the air like an inescapable haze. Yet, they maintained a steady pace, their heads held high, their gazes fixed forward, while simultaneously being fully cognizant of the confrontation that awaited them around the next bend. Ryan Mallory was already positioned there, leaning against the sun-drenched stone wall, his countenance a disconcerting blend of ennui and malevolence, as if this particular encounter was less a matter of deliberation and more an inevitable conclusion he had already decreed. Zach and Brent stood flanking him, their postures relaxed but their eyes sharp, anticipating their cue like predators observing their prey venturing within striking distance. "There they are," Ryan announced, his voice amplified sufficiently to draw the attention of every student in the vicinity. The sound carried across the courtyard like a signal flare, attracting a wider circle of onlookers who made no pretense of concealing their voyeuristic curiosity. "You too? I thought you'd have the good sense to stay home today." Jada's piercing gaze locked onto him instantly. She continued her stride, unfazed by his taunt, but the unwavering intensity of her eyes held him captive, cool, and resolute. "If that was your hope," she replied with effortless composure, her voice clear and even for all to hear. "Then your delusion runs deeper than I imagined." A low murmur rippled through the student onlookers, a wave of surprise at the sharp edge of her retort. Ryan's lips curled into a smirk, a flicker of annoyance momentarily betraying the carefully constructed facade. "You've got some serious nerve," Ryan snapped, pushing off the wall and closing the distance between them with the casual arrogance of someone who had never conceived of being challenged. "Talking like that, acting like you belong here." Janelle shifted her weight, her shoulders squaring. Her voice, though steady, carried the unspoken burden of every insult endured, every cruel prank silently swallowed until now. "We absolutely belong here," she stated firmly, her gaze locked on Ryan, unwavering. "More than you ever will. You swagger around as if you own this place, but deep down, you know the truth. Without your little entourage, you're just another coward hiding behind stale jokes and weak allies." Her words landed with a surprising impact, piercing the shallow armor Ryan wore as a shield. The crowd's murmur intensified. Students exchanged glances, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, the ground beneath this confrontation beginning to tremble. Ryan's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he further reduced the space between them. He was so close now that Jada could discern a flicker of uncertainty behind his glare, though he quickly masked it with a surge of fury. "Say that again," he challenged, his voice strained and brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. "You heard her the first time," Jada responded calmly, her gaze unwavering. "You just dislike confronting the truth when it's laid bare before you." Ryan's chest rose sharply as he fought to maintain his bravado, but the cracks were evident for all to see. He turned his glare towards the crowd, drawing strength from their attention, needing it to shore up his faltering confidence. "You think you're so tough? You think you can stand there and spew whatever you want without consequences?" "We don't speculate," Janelle stated, her tone sharpening just enough to cut through the surrounding noise. "We know." That was the final impetus Ryan needed to abandon words entirely. His hand shot out without warning, striking Jada's shoulder with brutal force, forcing her to recoil under the unexpected impact. She regained her balance effortlessly, her feet finding solid purchase on the ground as if rooted. The crowd gasped in unison, a sharp intake of breath as the scene escalated from tension to open aggression. Brent, seizing the opportunity, lunged towards Janelle, swiping her books from her grasp with a malicious grin, scattering pages across the pavement in a chaotic mess that mirrored the prank they had recently endured. Zach followed suit, shoving Janelle hard in the shoulder, his voice dripping with mockery. "What now? Going to run crying to your daddy?" That was the line, irrevocably crossed. Jada's eyes blazed at Ryan, her voice calm but simmering with a long-suppressed fury. "No," she declared, her breath steady, her words loud enough for everyone to hear. "We're done running." Without hesitation, she stepped forward, her movement fluid and controlled, and placed her palm flat against Ryan's chest with a sharp, practiced force that sent him stumbling backward, surprise widening his eyes as the air rushed out of him. Beside her, Janelle moved with equal grace, dropping low and sweeping Brent's legs out from under him with pinpoint precision, sending him sprawling to the ground with a heavy thud that instantly silenced his jeers. The courtyard erupted in a cacophony of shouts as students recoiled, forming a wide circle around the unfolding brawl. Their faces registered a mixture of shock and exhilaration as the twins took control of the moment. Ryan recovered quickly, his usual cocky smirk replaced by raw frustration as he charged at Jada, his swings wild. But she anticipated his attack, ducking beneath his flailing arm and delivering a powerful, controlled punch to his stomach. As Brent tried to regain his footing, Janelle was already there, twisting his shoulder and forcing him back down to the pavement. Her movements were sharp and assured, each action guided by years of training that flowed instinctively through her. Zach lunged at her, desperate and wild, but Janelle sidestepped cleanly, catching his arm as he rushed past and executing a precise throw that sent him crashing to the ground beside his friend, both gasping for air. Ryan, clutching his side, staggered back towards Jada with a snarl, but she met him with a clean strike to his chin, snapping his head back and forcing him to stumble away, his balance compromised. The twins acted in unison, without hesitation or second-guessing. Their father's lessons, ingrained through countless hours of practice, guided their every move. Each block, each counter, each strike. They weren't performing for the crowd. They weren't trying to prove anything. They were here because a boundary had been crossed and they were ready. The courtyard had transformed into their arena. As the fight intensified, it became evident to all present that Jada and Janelle were not the victims. They were the reckoning. The courtyard, which had begun the day with casual chatter and idle footsteps, now throbbed with an energy so palpable it felt as though every brick beneath their feet resonated with it. The circle of onlookers widened, their voices a mixture of shock and thrill, as Jada and Janelle moved with the ferocity of an unleashed storm. Their bodies operated in perfect synchronization, each strike and counter executed with precision, not born of blind rage, but of years of disciplined training. Ryan, driven back by Jada's swift and punishing blows, struggled to regroup, a flicker of fear now visible in his eyes, starkly contrasting with the flush of his skin and the sweat beading on his hairline. He had always considered himself invincible, protected by his status and his followers, but none of that offered any defense here. Stripped of his usual smug advantage, he faced someone who refused to cower and would not yield. "You thought we'd just take it," Jada stated, her breath controlled, her voice steady as she dodged another wild swing, responding with a sharp elbow to Ryan's ribs that elicited a grunt and a sideways stagger. "You thought you could keep pushing until we broke." Her words cut as deeply as her strikes. Ryan, still struggling for breath, found himself battling not only her fists, but the undeniable truth in her voice, loud enough for every observer to hear and feel. Brent, having scrambled to his feet, charged at Janelle with a frustrated snarl, but she met him head-on, slipping beneath his swing and driving her palm into his sternum with enough force to send him crashing backward, his body folding over itself as he landed hard, gasping for air. "You picked the wrong fight," Janelle added, her tone as sharp as steel as she watched Brent writhe on the ground, her eyes fixed on him, taking a deliberate step closer, ensuring he wouldn't rise easily. Zach, desperate to change the tide, grabbed a splintered piece of wood from a broken bench, gripping it tightly as he rushed towards Janelle with reckless abandon. But she saw him coming, as if in slow motion, her senses heightened by adrenaline and discipline, her body already in motion to intercept. She sidestepped his charge with fluid precision, her hand snapping out to catch his wrist in a firm, unyielding grip, twisting sharply to disarm him and send the makeshift weapon clattering harmlessly away. In the same motion, she spun, driving her elbow into the side of his face and sending him crashing to his knees, dazed and defeated. "Cheap shots won't save you now," she said, her voice low but clear, carrying across the circle of students who had fallen into a breathless silence, their earlier amusement replaced by awe and a touch of fear. Ryan, consumed by fury and embarrassment, lunged at Jada once more, his fists swinging wildly and sloppily, driven by panic rather than skill. But Jada was a step ahead, weaving under his attack and catching his wrist in a tight grip, twisting it sharply as she stepped in and drove her knee into his stomach with brutal force. His breath exploded from his lungs in a choked gasp as he collapsed to the ground, clutching his ribs. "You've had every opportunity to walk away," Jada stated firmly, her voice carrying the weight of everything she and her sister had endured, addressing not just Ryan, but every onlooker. "But you kept coming." She released his wrist, allowing him to fall fully to the pavement, his body folding over itself as he struggled to breathe, his face contorted with pain and disbelief. Janelle stood beside her sister, her chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. The two of them, side by side once more, just as they had been when they first entered the school, but now the ground beneath their feet felt different, as if claimed through sheer force of will. The surrounding crowd, once eager for spectacle, now stood in uneasy silence, the realization dawning that this was no ordinary fight, no mere exchange of blows between school rivals. This was something more profound, something decisive, a storm that had been gathering for too long and had finally broken free. "Maybe now you'll learn," Janelle said, her voice cutting through the charged air, "that we're not the ones you can push around." As if propelled by sheer stubborn pride, Brent attempted to rise again. But Janelle was there before he could fully lift himself, planting her foot firmly on his chest and pressing him back down with undeniable authority. He grunted in frustration, trapped beneath the weight of his own arrogance and her unwavering strength. "Stay down," she warned him, not as a threat, but as an irrefutable fact. Jada's gaze swept across the courtyard, meeting the eyes of every student brave enough to meet her gaze, her expression resolute and unyielding. The words were unnecessary, etched clearly on her face. This ends here, and it ends now. Yet even as the twins stood victorious over their tormentors, they understood this was not the true conclusion of the conflict. They sensed it in the crowd's uncomfortable shifts, in the absence of any teachers, in the nascent whispers already twisting the narrative. They knew there would be repercussions. Victory carried its own price. But they harbored no regrets. For the first time since arriving at this campus, they had made it unequivocally clear to everyone that they were not to be underestimated, toyed with, or humiliated without facing the consequences. The twins stood tall, their breathing steady, their eyes unblinking as they observed the defeated boys on the ground. The fight might have concluded for the moment, but the storm had only just begun. The aftermath of the confrontation did not descend into chaos as one might have expected, but rather into a strange, drawn-out silence that seemed to stretch each moment, amplifying the weight of what had just transpired, pressing down on every witness. Even as the bullies lay groaning on the pavement, nursing bruised ribs and wounded pride, the crowd that had once reveled in their cruelty stood frozen. Their earlier appetite for spectacle had dissolved into a cautious, almost guilty quiet. No adult had intervened during the fight, no teacher had stepped in to stop the unfolding events in plain sight, but now, as if summoned by the heavy atmosphere, they began to trickle onto the scene, their expressions etched with confusion and concern, though none could feign genuine surprise. Deep down, they had all seen this coming, or at least sensed the inevitability of something fracturing beneath the polished veneer of Rosewood Hills, and now that it had, they could no longer maintain their facade of ignorance. "Enough!" came the sharp voice of Mr. Carpenter, the assistant principal, as he pushed through the circle of students, his gaze sweeping the scene with an expression that mingled outrage with a strange sense of relief that he had arrived only after the violence had ceased. His eyes moved from the injured boys sprawled across the courtyard to the twins, standing resolutely at its center. Their breathing was controlled, their posture strong, their faces set with an unflinching calm that made it impossible to misinterpret their victory. "What is going on here?" Carpenter demanded, though the question hung in the air more as a formality than genuine inquiry, for the scene before him clearly dictated the narrative. Before Jada or Janelle could respond, Ryan coughed painfully and forced himself to speak through gritted teeth. They attacked us," he gasped, his voice thick with desperation and fear, yet laced with the familiar entitlement of someone who believed he could still control the story. "We didn't do anything. They just went crazy." The crowd shifted uneasily, their silence beginning to crack under the weight of the lie. Some students averted their gaze, unwilling to meet the eyes of the twins or the now gathering adults, while others stared at Ryan with uncertainty, as if unsure whether to follow his lead or acknowledge the reality they had witnessed. Jada's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure, her father's voice echoing in her mind. "Steady and unyielding control is power. Speak only when it matters." She met Carpenter's gaze directly, her eyes clear and sharp, and stated in a firm, even tone, "They have been targeting us since we arrived. Today, they escalated too far. We defended ourselves. Nothing more." Carpenter's expression flickered, a brief moment of discomfort crossing his features before he masked it with the tight professionalism that Rosewood Hills demanded of its staff. "We will sort this out inside," he said, though his words lacked any genuine promise or assurance of fairness. "All of you, come with me." The twins offered no protest. They exchanged a quiet glance, a look filled with unspoken understanding, and fell into step behind Carpenter as he led the small group away from the courtyard, leaving behind the scattered crowd of students whose initial excitement had curdled into unease. Inside the administrative offices, the walls felt closer, the air cooler, but none of it dulled the fire burning beneath the twins' calm exterior. They sat side by side on the stiff chairs outside the headmaster's office, their hands resting on their knees, their eyes fixed ahead as Ryan, Zach, and Brent exaggerated their injuries to anyone willing to listen, casting themselves as victims in a narrative they had distorted beyond recognition. Soon enough, their father arrived, his steps measured, his face composed, though beneath his quiet exterior lay a storm as fierce as the one that had driven his daughters to defend themselves. Derek Rivers entered the office with the steady confidence of a man who had faced far greater challenges and arrived prepared for every contingency. His eyes moved to his daughters first, assessing them not just for physical injury, but for their spirit's resilience. When their eyes met his, strong and unbroken, a flicker of pride passed between them. He then turned to the headmaster, a man named Harrington, whose suit was as impeccable as his expression was pinched, as though he had been compelled to step away from something far more significant than the well-being of his students. "We will be conducting a full investigation," Harrington stated, his tone clipped, his hands folded neatly before him on the polished desk. "But in the meantime, I'm afraid both of your daughters will be suspended until we can review the facts." Derek's voice, when it came, was calm but carried the weight of stone. "My daughters were defending themselves. That much is clear, but I expected as much from this institution." Harrington's eyes narrowed at the veiled accusation in Derek's words, but he offered no denial, only a thin, tight-lipped nod. Ryan's parents arrived not long after, and the atmosphere in the room immediately grew tense. Sandra Mallory swept into the office as if she owned it, her sharp heels clicking against the floor, her eyes burning with fury, masked behind a thin veil of practiced concern. Her husband, Greg, followed close behind, his broad frame rigid with anger, his jaw set tight as he shot a glare towards Derek and the twins. "This is unacceptable," Sandra snapped before anyone could speak. "Our son has been assaulted. And you're telling me these girls, these violent girls, are simply being suspended? They should be expelled, arrested." Her voice escalated with each word, and though Harrington attempted to placate her with vague promises of further action, it was evident that Sandra Mallory would not be satisfied until the twins faced disproportionate punishment. Derek's gaze remained fixed on her, his eyes steady and unreadable, but his daughters could sense the controlled force emanating from him, the same controlled power he had taught them to wield. He watched her rage ignite like dry kindling, fueled by falsehoods and arrogance, and he allowed her to vent her fury until her words dwindled. "This isn't over," Sandra hissed finally, her eyes narrowing to sharp points as she turned her glare fully on Derek, as if daring him to respond. "No," Derek replied evenly, his voice low and calm. "It's not." The weight of his words hung heavy in the room, not as a hasty threat, but as a promise forged in certainty. As the twins rose from the chairs, their suspension papers handed to them with cold efficiency, they held their heads high, their posture unbroken, their eyes clear. The fight in the courtyard had concluded, but a new one had begun, a battle that would not be settled with fists alone. And as they stepped out of the office, their father walking between them, they understood with perfect clarity that whatever came next, they would face it together. The house stood silent beneath the late afternoon sky, the soft hum of distant traffic and the rustling of leaves in the breeze offering a stillness that felt almost too profound, as if the storm that had begun in the halls of Rosewood Hills had followed them home, but lingered just beyond the horizon, awaiting the opportune moment to break through. Inside, the air was heavier than usual, not with fear or regret, but with the profound understanding that the events at school were not the end of their troubles. They had known it would follow them, They had known the Mallorys would not let it rest. Derek sat at the kitchen table, his posture relaxed but never careless. His gaze was locked on the open casement, a portal to the hushed thoroughfare below. It was as though he could anticipate what was approaching long before it materialized, and his daughters sat opposite him, the three of them, in quiet unison, not in silence, but in a state of shared preparedness. Their familial ties ran deeper than blood, forged by the crucible of all they had endured and every battle they had fought that very day. "You knew they'd find their way here," Jada stated, her voice a steady note, not a query, but a pronouncement of a truth they all recognized without utterance. Her father offered a subtle inclination of his head, his eyes still scanning the street, his thoughts already charting the course ahead. "Individuals of their ilk," Derek responded, his tone measured, his words precise. "They do not cede victory gracefully. They convince themselves of an inherent right to prevail, irrespective of factual accuracy. And when thwarted, they carry their grievances to your doorstep, assuming unpreparedness on your part." Janelle's attention drifted toward the window, her hands resting flat upon the table, her fingers relaxed yet poised. Her mind replayed her father's sentiments with the same meticulous focus she applied to every maneuver in the training grounds. "They believe we are defeated because we withdrew," she observed, her voice low yet sharp. "But they have never grasped the true essence of resilience." Before Derek could offer a reply, the distinct crunch of tires on gravel pierced the air, as clear and piercing as a sentinel's alarm. The subsequent clang of vehicle doors, heavy and resonant with anger, followed, then the unmistakable tread of expensive footwear on pavement, a symphony of entitlement and fury advancing toward their entrance with each deliberate step. "They've arrived," Jada declared softly. Though the words were superfluous, their presence was now undeniable. Derek rose from his seat with a single graceful movement, his presence commanding the space not with apprehension, but with an anchor of unwavering certainty. "Remain behind me," he instructed his daughters, not from apprehension of the impending confrontation, but with a desire for them to witness the execution of a defense when the sanctity of their home was breached. He wished for them to comprehend that fortitude was not solely measured by physical force, but by the steadfastness with which one held their ground against external pressures. Before the doorbell could sound, before a single rap could echo, Derek opened the portal himself, stepping onto the veranda with the unpretentious authority of one who had weathered far greater tempests than the one now looming. Sandra Mallory's countenance was contorted into a grimace of outrage, barely contained by a fragile veneer of social decorum, her gaze burning beneath immaculately coiffed hair and designer sunglasses perched atop her head like an emblem of artificial superiority. Greg Mallory stood beside her, his broad physique rigid with barely suppressed wrath, his jaw clenched, his fists balling at his sides. The veins in his neck protruded like tautly drawn cords. "You imagine you can evade repercussions for this?" Sandra hissed, foregoing any pleasantries, her words sharp and rapid as she advanced towards Derek, her heels striking the concrete with sharp clicks. "You believe you can lay hands upon our son without consequence?" Derek's expression remained unperturbed, his gaze unwavering as he met her fury with the serene steadfastness of a mountain facing a gale. "Your son initiated an assault on my daughters," he countered, his voice low, yet imbued with a resonance that filled the void between them. "They exercise self-defense. That is the unvarnished truth, irrespective of your willingness to acknowledge it. Do not presume the role of victim here." Greg interjected, his voice rough, almost trembling with indignation as he took a half-step forward, his stance aggressive, his fists continuing their rhythmic clenching and unclenching as if seeking a pretext to strike. "Your offspring are akin to beasts, much like yourselves, and you possess the audacity to feign innocence." The declaration lingered in the air, a noxious miasma, casting a chilling stillness over the moment. Yet Derek remained unprovoked. He allowed the insult to hang suspended, permitting it to reveal more about the man before him than any discourse could, and then he responded, Not with vehemence, but with absolute lucidity. Your judgment of our character is already solidified, Derek stated, his tone smooth as polished stone. However, that does not alter the facts. You cultivated a bully, and today he discovered the ramifications of transgressing a boundary. Sandra's features contorted further in anger, her mouth parting to unleash another invective. But before she could articulate it, her husband stepped past her, too consumed by his own rage to exercise restraint. "You believe you can patronize us in our own locale?" Greg boomed, his voice escalating as he unleashed a wild, heavy fist towards Derek, his face flushed with fury, his eyes wide with the blind conviction that brute force would triumph where verbal exchange had failed. But Derek was already in motion, already pivoting his body with practiced alacrity, his hand ascending to intercept Greg's wrist mid-swing. The momentum of the blow was completely arrested by the firm grip of Derek's steady hand. Greg's eyes widened in astonishment as Derek expertly twisted his arm just enough to destabilize him, guiding him into a sideways stumble before releasing him without expending superfluous energy. "You have made your selection," Derek declared evenly, his eyes as hard as iron. "Now you shall confront the ramifications." But Greg, blinded by his anger and lacking foresight, charged anew, this time with both hands outstretched in a clumsy attempt to overpower Derek, as if sheer physical might could surmount years of discipline and honed skill. Sandra, emitting an unintelligible shriek, attempted to follow, her hands clawing at Derek's arm, her fury a tempest of untamed rage. Derek moved with unblemished precision, stepping back sufficiently to draw both assailants forward, capitalizing on their momentum. He intercepted Greg's arm once more, disrupted his balance, and sent him sprawling onto the porch floor with a resounding thud that vibrated through the wooden planks. Sandra swung wildly at him, but Derek caught her wrist with equal smoothness, twisting her arm behind her back with deliberate, practiced control that rendered her immobilized, her breath escaping in sharp hisses through clenched teeth. "You intruded upon my sanctuary," Derek stated quietly, his voice resonating not merely with power but with finality. "You harbored the intention of instilling fear within this domicile, yet fear finds no purchase here." And with those words, the absolute truth of the moment descended, undeniable and complete. For an instant, a palpable stillness enveloped the porch, the sort of moment that feels stretched to its breaking point, susceptible to shattering with the slightest disturbance. The Mallorys were ensnared between fury and apprehension. Derek held Sandra with unwavering firmness, while Greg awkwardly struggled to rise from the wooden boards beneath him, his pride more wounded than his person, yet his eyes still aflame with a blind rage that precluded him from perceiving the futility of his actions. His face was flushed a deep crimson, veins bulging at his temples, his jaw clenched as he attempted to transmute his humiliation into renewed aggression, though any observer could discern his bravado was rapidly eroding under the weight of undeniable reality. "Release me," Sandra hissed, writhing against Derek's steady grasp, her voice sharp with a panic she attempted to mask as anger, but which betrayed itself beneath the surface. The strain was evident, regardless of her efforts to maintain composure. "Do you comprehend our identity?" Derek's eyes, steady and impassive, did not waver as he maintained his firm grip on her wrist. Not with enough force to inflict pain, but sufficient to leave no doubt regarding his command of the situation. "I am acutely aware of precisely who you are," he replied, his voice even and low, his gaze sharp as a blade honed through years of quiet conflict, "and it fails to impress me." Greg, now back on his feet, charged again impulsively, his movements clumsy with rage, his body lunging forward in a manner that clearly indicated he had never truly mastered combat, only domination through brute force and the implicit assumption of unresisting opposition. However, Derek had encountered such individuals far too frequently to be taken aback. He sidestepped Greg's charge with practiced ease, pivoting smoothly and utilizing his adversary's momentum to propel him directly into the porch railing, the wood groaning under the impact. "You presume this is concluded?" Greg barked, even as he staggered back, attempting to regain his breath, spitting his words through clenched teeth as though they held some inherent authority now that his physical attempts had failed. "You are finished. You and your daughters, every one of you." Derek's rejoinder was measured, devoid of any anger, for none was required. Only the unvarnished, irrefutable truth. "No," he stated, advancing toward Greg with the quiet authority of a man with nothing to prove and everything to safeguard. "You are." Greg launched another punch, wild and desperate, but Derek once again secured his arm, locking it firmly in his grasp before twisting him around and slamming him down onto the porch floor, flat on his back. The air was expelled from his lungs in a sharp gasp, leaving him sputtering beneath Derek's imposing shadow. Sandra screamed, her panic no longer concealed, as she attempted to break free, clawing at Derek's arm with trembling hands. However, her movements were erratic, saturated with a fear that had finally surfaced upon witnessing her husband's incapacitation. Derek released her wrist, not because she had compelled him to, but because his purpose in holding her had been fulfilled. Her strength had dissipated, drained in an instant as she stumbled backward, her chest heaving with frantic breaths. The twins stood just within the doorway, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama, their visages etched with serene concentration, not fear. They observed their father's handling of the Mallorys, not with unbridled aggression, but with controlled precision, each movement a lesson they had previously witnessed in practice and now observed in its fully realized form, a living testament to the discipline he had instilled throughout their lives. "This is their modus operandi," Derek declared, his voice loud enough to reach both the Mallorys and his daughters. His words were steady and resonant as he stepped over Greg's moaning form. "They assume they can invade our space, our lives, and dismantle us through intimidation and violence, but they overlook one crucial detail. We do not falter, we stand firm." Sandra's gaze flickered toward her husband, who lay struggling for breath, and then back to Derek, her lips parting, as if intending to articulate another threat or rationalization, but no sound emerged. Her breath hitched in her chest, her rage consumed by the crushing weight of her own helplessness. "Call the authorities!" she shrieked finally, her voice cracking under the strain of her escalating panic. "Summon them! He assaulted us!" Yet, even as she vocalized these accusations, a hollowness permeated them, a tremulous weakness that revealed her diminishing belief in her own pronouncements. "You initiated this," Derek reminded her, his voice never rising in volume, yet allowing each word to settle like a stone dropped into tranquil water, its ripples extending until escape was impossible. "You brought aggression to my threshold, and now you shall confront the consequences of your own actions." Greg, still gasping on the porch floor, managed to prop himself up on one elbow, his eyes wide with incredulity as he gazed up at Derek, perceiving not merely the man before him, but the entirety of what he had underestimated. All that he had failed to comprehend until this very moment had stripped him of his fabricated authority. Sirens, distant but steadily intensifying, began to reverberate through the neighborhood, their approaching sound slicing through the dense atmosphere like a sharp blade. Neighbors had emerged from their residences, drawn by the clamor and unfolding spectacle, their faces etched with a blend of curiosity and quiet satisfaction, as if they too had grown weary of the Mallorys' arrogance, and now observed with silent approval as justice manifested on the porch of the river home. Derek remained motionless, unfazed by the approaching sirens. He stood tall, unyielding, his daughters beside him, their eyes clear and filled with pride as they watched the scene unfold. Whatever the law enforcement agencies might bring next, they were prepared, having already triumphed in the paramount contest. This confrontation was never about the blows exchanged or the injuries sustained. It was about unwavering resolve when others expected them to capitulate. It was about demonstrating to the Mallorys, the educational institution, and the entire community that their inherent strength was inviolable, unassailable, irrespective of the pressures exerted. As the flashing lights rounded the corner and the first patrol car glided into the driveway, Derek's voice broke the pervasive silence one final time, its resonance carrying across the porch, across the yard, and into the collective memory of all present. "You sought a confrontation," he declared, his tone resolute, his demeanor as solid as the earth beneath him. "And now you have found it." The pulsating red and blue lights bathed the facade of the residence, their rhythm washing over the walls and windows in slow, deliberate waves, as if the tempest that had raged across their doorstep was not yet concluded, but merely transforming, exchanging physical combat and fury for the cold impartiality of uniformed officers and their badges. Derek remained resolute at the epicenter of the unfolding events. His daughters flanking him on either side, the trio framed by the doorway like an unbroken bulwark against the chaos that had attempted to breach their sanctuary. The initial officers disembarked from their vehicles with practiced caution. Their hands remained near their holsters, their gazes meticulously assessing the scene, interpreting the details with silent calculation. The two prone figures on the porch floor, disheveled and breathless. The man standing erect before them, composed and resolute. The neighbors congregated at the perimeters of their lawns, observing with strained expressions, some with arms crossed, others murmuring amongst themselves amidst the fading wail of the sirens. Sandra Mallory's voice shattered the prevailing tension first, sharp and agitated, its volume escalating as she advanced towards the officers, her arms gesturing wildly as if she could compel their allegiance through sheer force of desperation. "Officer, officer, apprehend him!" she demanded, pointing an accusatory digit at Derek, her face flushed with anger and a more profound emotion concealed beneath it, raw fear, poorly masked by her rage. "He attacked us. We were exercising our right to self-defense and he committed assault within our community." Her words cascaded over each other in a torrent, her breath growing more labored with each accusation. But the lead officer, a man whose badge bore the name Kleene, did not react with immediate assent. He raised a steady hand, his eyes sweeping not only over Sandra, but the entire tableau, discerning it with the quiet acumen of one who had witnessed sufficient human predicaments to understand that truth rarely resided on the surface. "Madam," Officer Kleene stated, maintaining a measured and professional tone, "I require you to step back and compose yourself. We will resolve this matter, but I need to hear from all parties, and I will commence by speaking with the homeowner." Sandra opened her mouth to object, but something in Kleene's unwavering gaze arrested her. She exhaled sharply, her chest rising and falling as she retreated to stand beside Greg, who still lay groaning on the porch floor, clutching his ribs with one arm as if the physical discomfort could lend greater credence to his eventual testimony. Officer Kleene then approached Derek, his expression cautious but not adversarial, his tone impartial. "Sir," he inquired, "could you please recount the events that transpired here?" Derek met the officer's gaze directly, his posture firm, his voice calm, and even as he articulated. "They arrived at my residence uninvited," he explained, his words delivered with deliberate weight and clarity. "They were incensed regarding an incident at the school involving our children. They confronted me on my porch. They issued threats, and then he," Derek gestured with a subtle nod toward Greg, "initiated the first physical engagement. I acted in defense of myself and my family." "And your daughters?" Kleene inquired, his eyes briefly glancing towards Jada and Janelle, who stood silently yet resolutely beside their father. "They were witnesses to the entire incident," Derek responded without hesitation, his tone unwavering. "They did not participate. They remained indoors, precisely as I instructed." Kleene offered a slight nod, his gaze pensive, weighing Derek's account against the scene before him. He then turned his attention to Sandra and Greg, his notepad in hand, prepared to receive their perspective, though the quiet tension in his expression suggested he had already begun to assemble a coherent narrative. Sandra launched into her version of the events with the same breathlessness and urgency she had displayed earlier, skillfully weaving falsehoods to portray herself and her husband as victims of an unprovoked assault, their words dripping with an entitlement that cast Derek in the role of the aggressor. However, her performance faltered under the steady scrutiny of Officer Kleene, whose eyes darkened with quiet skepticism as her narrative progressed, his demeanor betraying no outward reaction. "And you assert you were acting in self-defense?" Cleen inquired once she concluded, his tone carefully neutral, yet underscored by palpable doubt. "We came here to discuss the matter," Sandra insisted, her voice escalating again, but the cracks in her facade were evident, her composure fraying at the edges as she struggled to maintain her fabricated account. "He attacked us." Cleen's eyes narrowed subtly, and then, as if sensing that words alone were insufficient to unearth the truth, he turned his attention to the growing assembly of neighbors observing from the fringes of their lawns, some holding their mobile phones, others conversing quietly amongst themselves. "I will require witness statements," Cleen announced, his voice carrying across the lawn with an air of quiet authority. "Anyone who observed the unfolding events, please step forward." A prolonged pause ensued, heavy with unspoken tension, and then, slowly, as if galvanized by a shared sense of justice that had awaited its opportune moment, a neighbor from across the street stepped forward. An elderly gentleman, his face lined and his eyes sharp, missing nothing. He cleared his throat and spoke with a firm voice, audible to all. "I witnessed the entire occurrence," he stated. "They arrived shouting from the moment they exited their vehicle. The man initiated the physical altercation. The homeowner only responded when provoked." Another neighbor followed suit, then another, their collective testimonies interweaving to construct a more lucid portrayal, a chorus of truth that pierced through Sandra's fabrications like sunlight dispelling fog. Each account corroborated Derek's earlier statement, their recollections precise and their delivery steady. Cleena listened intently to every word, his pen moving rhythmically across his notepad. When the final neighbor concluded their statement, he closed the pad with a quiet snap that seemed to resonate more profoundly than the sirens had moments before. "We will continue this investigation at the station," he declared, his tone leaving no room for dissent. "However, based on the information gathered thus far, it appears we have further inquiries for you both." His gaze settled upon Sandra and Greg, their faces pale and drawn beneath the stark illumination of the police lights. Officers moved to assist Greg to his feet, cuffing him gently yet firmly as Sandra's protests recommenced, now thinner, weaker, her voice trailing off into helplessness as the weight of irrefutable reality bore down upon her with unyielding finality. Derek remained impassive as they were escorted away. His daughters by his side, his breathing steady and measured, his gaze fixed not on the departing Mallorys, but on the distant horizon beyond them, where justice at long last was beginning to assert its rightful place. And though the night was far from concluded, though questions would still demand answers and shadows would still require dispelling, the shift that had commenced was unmistakable. The tide was turning, and this time it was turning in their favor. The police station exuded a sterile quietude, a place that had absorbed countless lives, an arena where voices had risen in panic and protest, and where truth had been distorted by the burden of presumption. As Derek and his daughters occupied the unassuming metal chairs in the waiting area, an uncharacteristic calm settled over them. There was no trace of apprehension, no tremble in their hands or irregularity in their breathing. Instead, a quiet, measured patience emanated from them, the hallmark of a family that had weathered far more formidable tempests. They understood intrinsically that the sole path forward was to remain steadfast, allowing truth to surface, gradually yet inexorably, much like the unyielding tide against steadfast rocks. Officer Cleen navigated the space between desks and cabinets with the focused intensity of a man who could discern the contours of deceit the instant it was uttered. He had witnessed a multitude of similar predicaments to the one currently unfolding, rendering him adept at distinguishing genuine substance from mere clamor. His approach was methodical, diligently collecting statements, reviewing the testimonies of neighbors who had readily provided written accounts, and examining footage from nearby doorbell cameras offered without hesitation by residents eager for a semblance of justice to be properly administered. Derek observed him with quiet contemplation, his gaze tracking the officer's every movement, not with suspicion, but with a palpable respect for the man's thoroughness. He perceived not the hasty judgment of an investigator eager to conclude a case, but the deliberate, unwavering persistence of someone who grasped that genuine resolutions emerged not from those who vocalized the loudest, but from those who stood firmest on solid ground. Jada and Janelle sat nestled beside their father, their postures erect, their countenances serene, although inwardly they both felt the profound resonance of all they had endured, all they had borne, surfacing as the station's walls seemed to draw closer and the extended wait lengthened. Yet, even amidst the subdued tension, they did not waver. They had weathered more severe trials and emerged unbent, and they harbored the certainty that they would emerge from this one likewise. Cleany eventually approached, his notepad secured beneath one arm, his expression pensive, etched with the gravity of the information he had accumulated. He paused before them, gently clearing his throat before speaking. "Mr. Rivers," he began, his voice carefully measured yet firm, "I've reviewed the neighbor statements and security footage, and it's clear you didn't initiate the confrontation. It's also clear your actions were defensive." Derek offered a subtle nod, acknowledging the officer's pronouncements without any sense of triumph or relief, but with the quiet, unwavering demeanor of a man who expected nothing less from the truth. Clean continued, shifting his weight slightly as he consulted his notes. "What's more, the footage we've collected also shows that the Mallorys came to your property aggressively. They crossed onto your porch first. They raised their voices, and they initiated physical contact. Multiple angles confirm this." A soft exhale passed between Jada and Janelle. Not quite a sigh, but the gentle release of pent-up tension, a moment of quiet reassurance settling in their chests, like a small ember refusing to be extinguished, regardless of the winds that had battered it. Nevertheless, Clean proceeded, his tone remaining even. "Given the severity of the injuries and the Mallorys' claims, we'll need to document everything fully. There will be formal statements, a full report, and there may still be legal proceedings, but I want you to know," he added, his gaze settling on Derek with an emotion that bordered on admiration. "From what I've seen, the evidence is clearly in your favor." Derek's reply came instantaneously. His voice, low and assured, stated, "I will provide you with every answer you require." As they followed Clean into the interview room, Jada and Janelle felt the significance of the moment deepen within their very core. Not as a burden, but as a poignant reminder of the arduous journey that had brought them to this juncture. They sat beside their father, responding to inquiries with lucidity, recounting the day's events with steady voices that conveyed the unvarnished truth of their experience, leaving no room for doubt or misrepresentation. Piece by piece, their narrative unfolded under the keen observation of the officers, not as a distorted fabrication born of fear and prejudice, but as a clear, unbroken sequence of facts leading from the initial push in the courtyard to the final confrontation at their threshold. They spoke of the preceding days of torment, of the malicious prank that had brought them to their breaking point, of the fight thrust upon them by individuals who believed themselves immune to repercussions. They articulated their story not as victims, but as survivors, and as their account filled the room, the irrefutable shape of the truth became undeniable. Later, as they emerged from the interview room into a more secluded section of the station, Derek turned to his daughters, his voice gentle yet imbued with the weight of hard-won wisdom. "You see how this unfolds," he remarked, "not as a lesson, but as a confirmation of what they intrinsically understood. They will endeavor to distort the narrative, to claim it as their own. However, truth possesses patience. It waits, and when the moment is ripe, it stands tall." Jada met his gaze, her eyes shining with determination. "We're not finished yet," she stated, her voice firm. Janelle nodded beside her, her expression equally steadfast. "But we are making progress." Clean approached once more, a subtle tension in his jaw as he reopened his notepad. "There's something else," he said, his tone cautious yet resolute. "One of your neighbors alluded to earlier difficulties at the school. We're going to obtain surveillance footage from the school premises as well. If there's a pattern, it will expedite the resolution of this matter." At these words, a quiet wave of comprehension passed between Derek and his daughters. They had shouldered the burden of the bullying in isolation until this point, enduring in silence while the school remained complicitly indifferent. However, if the truth of those days could finally come to light, then this struggle would not only clear their names, but also expose the deep-seated corruption that had festered within Rosewood Hills for far too long. "Proceed," Derek commanded without hesitation. "Let the complete story emerge." Kleena offered a brief nod and stepped away to place the call, his movement sufficient, his objective clear. As a renewed quiet descended upon the station, the twins and their father sat together, resolute and unshakable, cognizant that the storm had not entirely abated, but also aware that the tide had irrevocably shifted in their favor, and whatever lay ahead, they would be prepared. The low hum of the fluorescent lights permeated the station, a steady, unobtrusive sound that might have been insignificant in any other context, but here, under the immense pressure of unfolding events, it seemed to underscore each passing second, stretching time as the final fragments of truth began to coalesce. Derek sat with his daughters close at his side. The three of them, a steadfast bastion of resolve in a room that had become charged with palpable tension, the atmosphere thick with the scent of paper, ink, and the slow, burgeoning fire of justice finally catching hold. Across the room, visible through the narrow glass partitions of the adjoining office, Sandra and Greg Mallory were seated at a separate table, their composure visibly deteriorating under the mounting pressure. Sandra's sharp features, once defined by an almost entitled self-assurance, were beginning to falter, her eyes darting between officers, her lips pressed into a thin line as if attempting to suppress the fear trembling just beneath the surface. Greg sat heavier in his chair, his shoulders slumped in a manner that suggested more than mere physical discomfort. His gaze averted from the window, from Derek's eyes, from the inevitable. Officer Clean re-entered the room, a folder bulging with printed photographs and reports tucked under his arm. His expression was sharpened by the clarity that only irrefutable evidence could provide. He moved with a purposeful stride that filled the space, pulling a chair closer to the table before setting down the folder and opening it, the first page illuminated by the harsh overhead light. It was a still image captured by a neighbor's security camera depicting Greg Mallory mid-swing, his face contorted with rage, his fist aimed at Derek's head. Without uttering a word, Cleany spread the images across the table, each one more incriminating than the last, meticulously documenting the escalation frame by frame. The truth was laid bare in a sequence of moments too unambiguous to dismiss. There was no ambiguity in the photographs, no space left for distorted accounts or fabricated excuses, only the stark, undeniable fact that the Mallorys had brought their fury to Derek's doorstep and initiated the confrontation themselves. Derek's gaze remained fixed on the images, his face composed, his breathing measured, and even, not because the evidence surprised him, but because it affirmed what he had known from the outset, that truth, though perhaps delayed, had never abandoned their cause. "We've also retrieved initial footage from the school's surveillance system," Clean continued, his voice firm as he presented a second set of images. These were darker and grainier, yet no less illustrative in their narrative. The camera had captured the prank at the lockers, the boys cornering his daughters in the hallway, the shove that precipitated the altercation in the courtyard. Combined with these, the witness statements from your neighbors and the admissions made by a few students after we followed up, we have a strong case building in your favor. At his words, a quiet breath passed between Jada and Janelle. It wasn't relief born of weakness, but rather the slow, measured exhalation of a burden beginning to lift from their shoulders. "And the Mallorys?" Derek inquired, his voice low yet steady, carrying the question not with desperation, but with the weight of responsibility, like a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. Clean's mouth tightened for a fraction of a second before he replied, his words carefully chosen, yet leaving no room for doubt. "They're in deep," he stated, his tone edged with a quiet finality. "They arrived here full of bluster, assuming their story would carry weight on its own. But with this evidence, their accusations are rapidly disintegrating. The more they speak, the deeper they dig their own grave." As Clean spoke, Derek's attention was drawn by movement beyond the glass. Another officer entered the room where Sandra and Greg sat, a substantial stack of papers in hand, placing them on the table with a thud that seemed to reverberate through the very air. Sandra's mouth moved, her words lost behind the glass, but her escalating panic was evident, her gestures sharp and frantic as she attempted to argue against the growing mountain of facts. Greg, for all his earlier aggression, remained silent now, his gaze fixed on the table before him, his hands clasped tightly together as if he could ward off the consequences through sheer force of will. "Let them see it all," Derek said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, though Clean heard him clearly and offered a small nod of agreement. "Let them witness what transpires when they push too far." "We intend to," Clean replied, closing the folder with a deliberate motion, as if sealing the Mallory's fate within its pages. Moments later, they were joined by another officer, younger, his uniform crisply pressed, but his expression already hardened by the realities of his profession. He held a printed transcript, placing it before Clean with a subtle nod. "Statements from 2 of the students," the officer explained, his voice steady. "They corroborate prior harassment at the school, consistent with Mr. Rivers and his daughter's report." Clean scanned the pages swiftly, his eyes sharpening with each line he read. "That should suffice," he declared at last, setting the papers down with a quiet resonance that seemed to settle not just on the table, but in the surrounding atmosphere. "We will be proceeding with charges, assault, trespassing, possibly harassment, once the full scope at the school is established." Derek displayed no outward reaction, his composure undisturbed. However, Jada and Janelle sensed a subtle shift in their father's posture, a quiet satisfaction of a man who had stood his ground, not merely for the sake of victory, but for justice itself. Sandra's voice, sharp even through the glass, rose once more, a desperate sound devoid of its earlier confidence. Greg's shoulders sagged further, his head lowering, as if he could no longer bear the weight of the truth pressing in from all sides. Officer Clean turned back to Derek and his daughters, his expression softening into something akin to respect. "You've handled yourselves admirably," he stated simply. "This won't be easy, and it's not over yet. But you did the right thing." Derek inclined his head once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than gratitude, for he had never sought approval, only what was right. As the officers began to process the Mallorys, escorting them from the interview room with firm, unyielding steps, the Rivers family remained seated, their gazes steady, their hearts aligned in quiet solidarity. The tide had not merely turned, it had begun to wash away the falsehoods, revealing the truth beneath, and though the conflict had yet to reach its ultimate conclusion, they could perceive the end on the horizon as certain and unwavering as the rising sun. And when that moment arrived, they would face it together. The station seemed to hold its breath under the weight of everything that had come to light, as if the very walls, the air itself, had grown heavy with the truth finally forced into the open, too real and too substantial to be denied or reshaped by the hands of those who had once considered themselves untouchable. Derek, seated between his daughters, remained immobile, his gaze unwavering as he observed the officers carry out their tasks. Their movements, no longer hurried or uncertain, were deliberate, shaped by the clarity of evidence that had been meticulously assembled, brick by brick, into an impenetrable bulwark around the Mallory's disintegrating defense. Across the room, through the narrow strip of glass separating the main floor from the smaller holding area, Sandra paced like a caged animal, her hands twisted into tight fists at her sides, her eyes wild as she searched for something, some breach in the wall, some thread to pull loose that might unravel the case, rapidly closing around her. But there was nothing left for her to grasp. No more lies to weave that hadn't already become so tangled as to be unescapable. Greg, once vociferous and self-assured, now sat slumped in his chair, his elbows resting heavily on his knees, his head bowed low beneath the crushing weight of failure. His eyes, dulled and lost, stared at the floor as though the answers he sought might materialize there if only he looked hard enough, but he found nothing except the hollow echo of his own choices staring back at him. Officer Clean stood at the epicenter of it all, his posture firm, his expression sharpened by the finality of the moment. He flipped through the last of the statements and recordings gathered in the hours since the Mallorys had been brought in. His mind replayed the complete narrative laid bare before him. Neighbor testimonies were clear and consistent. Camera footage from multiple angles painted an undeniable picture. Student witnesses at the school filled in any gaps that might have been overlooked. He turned to Derek, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had endured to reach this point. "We've completed our preliminary findings," Clean began, his tone steady and without hesitation. "The charges against you and your daughters will be dropped immediately. The evidence leaves no room for any other decision." Jada and Janelle shared a glance, a silent moment of understanding passing between them, not of surprise, for they had always known their truth would prevail, but of quiet vindication, the kind that doesn't shout in triumph, but settles deep in the chest, steady and certain. Derek inclined his head slightly, his composure unshaken, though beneath his calm exterior there was the faintest of shifts, a release of the tension he had carried for his daughters, for his family, every moment of this battle weighing on him more heavily than he would ever allow to show. "And the Mallorys?" Derek asked, not because he needed the answer, but because it mattered that the words were spoken plainly for all to hear. Clean's gaze hardened as he responded. "They will face charges," he confirmed, unfolding each count with quiet precision as if placing stones on a scale. "Assault, harassment, trespassing, and obstruction. Their actions at the school and here at your home are well documented. They won't be talking their way out of this." As if to underscore the statement, another officer stepped into the holding area, unlocking the door with a sharp twist of the key and motioning for Sandra and Greg to rise. Sandra's protests, sharp and escalating in panic, fell flat against the officer's steady commands. Her words reduced to mere noise beneath the full weight of the law now pressing down upon her. "You have no right," she cried, her voice cracking beneath the strain, but the officer guiding her offered no response, only the silent firmness of duty performed without bias. Greg, drained of fight, rose slowly, his shoulders slumped as the cuffs clicked into place around his wrists. His gaze flickered to Derek for just a breath of a moment before falling away, unable to hold the eyes of the man he had so profoundly underestimated. The twins watched in silence, not with gloating, not with cheers, but with a deep, quiet satisfaction that stemmed from knowing they had stood firm against the storm and refused to be broken. They had met animosity not with fear, but with courage. They had responded to violence not with surrender, but with a strength derived from years of discipline and from the unshakable bond they shared with their father and with each other. As the Mallorys were led from the room, their departure marked by a sense of finality, Officer Clean turned back to the family with a gentler tone. "You've conducted yourselves well," he said, pausing as if weighing his words before adding, "You held your ground with honor. That matters more than you realize." Derek offered no verbal response, needing none. His steady gaze followed the Mallorys until they disappeared through the exit, swallowed by the system they had believed would protect them, but which had instead exposed their true nature to the world. The station began to settle. Following that, the frantic energy of the day cooled into a calmer rhythm as officers filed reports and finalized the necessary paperwork. Clean assured Derek that the official exoneration documents would be forthcoming within the hour and that the school would also be notified of the findings, though Derek already knew that particular battle was one he would gladly see through to its conclusion. Jada and Janelle, though weary from the protracted hours of questioning and waiting, remained poised and unbowed, their eyes sharp, their shoulders squared as they prepared to depart the station, fully cognizant that while this chapter had closed, the lessons etched into their spirits would never fade. As the three of them stood together, their silhouettes framed against the dimming light filtering through the station's windows, there was a quiet power in their unity, an unspoken promise that no matter what lay ahead, they would confront it not as victims of someone else's narrative, but as the architects of their own. They had fought, they had endured, and they had triumphed. The morning sun stretched across the facade of Rosewood Hills Academy, casting long beams of light over the familiar pathways and polished brick buildings. Today, however, the light seemed sharper, clearer, as if the very air had been purified after a long, bitter storm. The courtyard, once the venue for hushed footsteps and venomous gossip, now possessed a different atmosphere, not one burdened by dread, but alive with the subtle tremor of transition, a quiet alteration that permeated the grounds, not through boisterous declarations, but through the palpable, anxious energy of those acutely aware of a fundamental shift. News had disseminated with astonishing speed, propelled not by mere speculation, but by the irrefutable facts unearthed following the apprehension of the Mallorys, accompanied by the incriminating evidence presented for all to witness. Students who had once readily joined Ryan and his companions in their jests now congregated in hesitant groups, their conversations subdued, their gazes more guarded as they observed the main entrance, anticipating the twins' imminent arrival. Educators who had previously sidestepped the issue of bullying, opting for silence over active intervention, now displayed a noticeable stiffness in their demeanor, a veiled embarrassment clouding their countenances as they braced for an unavoidable confrontation. Within the administrative suite, Headmaster Harrington stood with his posture rigid, bearing the immense pressure of the circumstances that had abruptly destabilized his institution. Clutched in his hands were the official documents presented by the police, documents that left no room for equivocation or delay. His attention moved to the names listed under the clear and unambiguous charges: Ryan Mallory, Zach Carver, Brent Larson, and appended to their names the definitive and irreversible consequence: expulsion, effective immediately. Across from him sat Derek Rivers, remarkably composed. His bearing was as steady as it had been at the police precinct, his eyes meeting the headmaster's with an unyielding, quiet authority. Beside him, Jada and Janelle sat with an air of poise, their uniforms immaculate, their expressions reflecting the fortitude of individuals who had weathered a tempest and emerged not merely intact, but unyielding. The board convened early this morning. Harrington began, his voice strained, betraying the discomfort of a man compelled to confront his own shortcomings. In light of the investigation's findings and the overwhelming evidence of harassment and assault directed at your daughters, the suspension has been rescinded, effective immediately. They will return to their classes today. He paused, clearing his throat, a gesture of unease as he shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening their grip on the edges of the papers. Furthermore, he continued, the students responsible for the harassment and the attack have been expelled permanently. A moment of silence ensued, not out of necessity, but because it felt appropriate to allow the pronouncements to resonate, to fully absorb their impact before proceeding. Derek's voice, when he finally spoke, was devoid of any hint of vindication or smug satisfaction, conveying only the profound, unshakable calm of a father who had pursued justice and witnessed its realization. That is the resolution that should have been enacted from the outset, he stated simply, not as an indictment, but as an unassailable truth. Harrington's lips thinned. A fleeting, inscrutable expression crossed his eyes. Whether it stemmed from regret, humiliation, or a blend of both, it was impossible to ascertain. Nevertheless, he gave a slight nod, a subtle yet meaningful acknowledgement. "We failed your family," he confessed, his voice now softer, roughened by the gravity of the confession. "We failed in our obligation to safeguard all our students. That will change." Jada's gaze remained fixed on the headmaster with the same unwavering composure that had sustained her through every malicious remark, every physical push, every effort to diminish her and her sister's self-worth. "See that it does," she declared. Her words, measured yet resolute, left no opening for insincere assurances. "And not just for us," Janelle's voice chimed in with equal conviction. "For every student who doesn't conform to your expectations." For an instant, Harrington appeared to falter under the weight of their pronouncements, but then he offered a slight nod, the papers trembling almost imperceptibly in his grasp as he finally set them down. As they stood from their chairs, Derek gently placed a hand on each of his daughter's shoulders, a silent gesture of paternal pride that conveyed its meaning without utterance. Together, they exited the office and entered the main corridor, their footsteps resonating through the marble passageway, a path that had once felt like an obstacle course but now seemed cleared by their fortitude and unwavering resolve. Students turned to observe them, some with undisguised curiosity, others with quiet admiration, and a few with lingering shame etched onto their faces, recalling their own complicity. Whether through action or inaction, none dared to voice their thoughts. None presumed to taunt or deride. The magnitude of the recent events had stripped them of any pretense, leaving them exposed, without a comfortable shadow to conceal themselves within. The twins walked in unison, their heads held high, their postures erect, not as returning victims, but as triumphant arbiters of their own narrative, living proof that resilience in the face of malevolence can dismantle even the most formidable fortresses of prejudice. Outside the building, the morning air, cool and refreshing, brushed against their faces as if the very atmosphere acknowledged the long-awaited shift. Their father joined them, his presence a reassuring anchor, and together they traversed the courtyard, not with hurried steps, but with the measured, confident stride of those who had rightfully earned every advancement. As they moved, Derek's voice, low and steady, broke the surrounding quiet. "The storm has passed," he stated, not as a hopeful wish, but as a definitive declaration, as certain and unshakable as the dawn. "No," Jada replied, her gaze fixed on the path ahead, her tone imbued with the quiet strength that had seen her through adversity. "We ended it." A subtle yet fiercely determined smile touched Janelle's lips, her eyes luminous in the morning light. "And we will end it again," she added, "whenever it arises." Together they crossed the threshold of the school, leaving behind the lingering vestiges of doubt and stepping fully into the clarity of justice. It was finally over. And though the future would undoubtedly present its own trials, they possessed an unshakable certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would confront them just as they had this one, united, unbroken, and devoid of fear. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so seamless it felt as though the ordeal had scarcely touched them. It was as if the tempestuous winds of animosity that had once buffeted them had finally subsided into mere distant echoes. Yet Jada and Janelle never forgot. They did not bear the weight of their experience as a burden, but rather as something far more potent and enduring, a testament to their own inner strength, woven into the fabric of their every movement across the familiar grounds of Rosewood Hills Academy. The institution itself seemed subtly transformed, as if it had learned to exhale differently, the atmosphere no longer thick with the unspoken sanction of cruelty. Educators, once prone to tight lips and averted gazes, now greeted the twins with a respect that felt genuine, not merely imposed. They called their names in class, not with indifference, but with sincere consideration, their voices steady, their eyes meeting theirs without the former hesitation. Their peers, too, had shed the complacency they had once worn so readily. No longer did the hallways reverberate with derisive laughter or clandestine whispers. Instead, there were gestures of recognition, small yet meaningful, and moments of quiet where silence conveyed respect rather than avoidance. In the courtyard, where they had once navigated under the scrutiny of countless judgmental eyes, Jada and Janelle now moved with uninhibited freedom, their heads held high, their steps unhurried. They would sit beneath the ancient oak during their midday meal. Sunlight warmed their faces as they conversed about a myriad of topics, their voices light with the ease of those no longer compelled to censor their words, their glances, their very presence. This was not an illusion of perfection, for such an ideal had never been their pursuit. What they now possessed was infinitely more valuable. A tranquility founded not on the absence of fear, but on the hard-won resilience forged in the crucible of hardship. They understood that the struggle they had endured had not only liberated them, but had irrevocably altered the very foundations of the school, a silent yet unbreakable transformation that would persist long after the memory of the Mallorys had faded. Their father's counsel remained with them, not as faint recollections, but as living principles held dear. "Stand your ground," he had urged them repeatedly, and they had done precisely that, not only for themselves, but for every student who now walked those same halls, and for all who would follow. As the afternoon sun began its descent, casting elongated shadows across the verdant expanse, the twins sat side by side, their laughter rising effortlessly and genuinely, their eyes alight with the simple contentment of a day well lived. They had not merely survived Rosewood Hills Academy, they had claimed it. And as they surveyed the grounds, the place that had once sought to silence them, they saw only the boundless horizon of the life they had meticulously constructed through their own determination, their shared courage, and their unbreakable bond. They had achieved victory, and they would continue to prevail with each passing day. I trust you found this narrative engaging. Kindly share it with your acquaintances, and subscribe to ensure you don't miss subsequent installments. In the interim, I have personally selected 2 stories that I believe will resonate with you. I wish you a pleasant day.